In the spring of 1944, in a room thick with cigarette smoke and quiet tension, a group of German intelligence officers in Berlin leaned over a conference table buried under photographs, intercepted radio messages, and reconnaissance reports. They were not studying the usual things, not the disposition of Allied divisions, not shipping tonnage into British ports, not the endless columns of supply trucks. They were hunting one man. One American general had become so important to them that he consumed more of their intelligence resources than any other Allied commander alive. His name was George S. Patton, and the German High Command was obsessed with one question: where would he appear next? It was not Eisenhower they feared in that room, though he commanded the entire Allied war effort in the West. It was not Montgomery, the British hero of El Alamein, who had driven Rommel out of North Africa. The officers sorting photographs and decrypts knew those men. They respected them as professionals. But Patton was different. Patton unsettled them. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in Western Europe, ordered that any scrap of information about Patton's location be treated as priority intelligence. Whenever a report mentioned that familiar, sharp-featured face or the pearl-handled pistols on his hips, it moved to the top of the pile. He had fought many Allied generals. Patton was the one who made him uneasy. The first serious encounter with Patton had come in November of 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, landing tens of thousands of American troops on the coast of Morocco. It was the first major American ground operation against the Axis in the European theater. German commanders watched closely. They had studied generals all their lives: patterns, habits, weaknesses. They believed that if you understood how a man thought, you could defeat him before the battle even began. What they saw in this new American commander disturbed them. The United States Army, in German eyes, was supposed to be slow and deliberate. Americans preferred methodical advances, careful planning, and overwhelming firepower. Patton did not move like that. Within 3 days of the landings, Casablanca had fallen, and French resistance had collapsed. Patton's troops moved inland at a speed that left German observers scrambling to keep their maps updated. Reports from German and Italian liaison officers in the region began to mention the same thing. This American general did not behave like other Americans. He advanced too quickly, took too many risks, seemed too eager to close with the enemy. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean, took notice. He requested a full intelligence profile of this George Patton. Who was he? Where had he served? What was his temperament? The answers that came back were not reassuring. Patton, they learned, had spent much of his career studying European warfare. He read German military theory in the original language. He had walked the old battlefields of the Western Front from the First World War, tracing the paths where German armies had come close to breaking France in 1914 and 1918. He understood German operational art not as an adversary guessing from the outside, but almost as an initiate reading from inside the tradition. In their files, this made him dangerous. In February of 1943, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched a sharp offensive at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The attack shattered inexperienced American units. The defensive lines broke. Soldiers fled in confusion, abandoning equipment along the roads. It became the worst defeat the United States Army would suffer in the entire war. German commanders watched with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. They had expected these amateurs to break eventually. The real question was, what would happen next? Would the Americans retreat and avoid major engagements? Would they sack their commanders and descend into hesitation and panic? Or would they learn? The answer arrived in early March. George Patton was given command of the battered 2nd Corps, the very formation that had collapsed at Kasserine. German intelligence picked up the transfer quickly. They already had files on him. They watched the front to see what difference, if any, this one man could make. The transformation stunned them. Within weeks, the same troops who had been running in panic were advancing with grim determination. Patton imposed discipline with a ferocity the Germans recognized. Helmets were worn correctly. Vehicles were kept ready. Lines of supply were tightened. The army moved as if a steel rod had been driven down its spine. Reconnaissance units began reporting something new. American patrols probing German positions aggressively, harassing outposts, testing defenses with a boldness that had not been seen before. Rommel, who had mocked the Americans as amateurs, made a note in his diary that something fundamental had changed in their behavior. This could not be explained by a handful of replacements or a shipment of new tanks. The tempo was different. The mentality was different. Someone new was in control. Someone who understood that war favored those who moved fastest. By July of 1943, the Allies were ready for their next step, the invasion of Sicily. The island was the gateway to mainland Italy, and the plan called for a familiar arrangement. General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army would land on the southeastern coast and drive north along the narrow side of the island toward Messina. Patton's new command, the American 7th Army, would protect Montgomery's flank, absorbing pressure and securing the western half. On paper, Montgomery had the starring role. Patton was the supporting player. On paper. As soon as boots hit Sicilian soil, Patton began rewriting the script. Rather than sit obediently on the flank, he drove his army forward with reckless speed across the western and central parts of the island. Town after town fell in rapid succession. His tanks roared over dusty roads. Infantry marched long hours under the punishing sun, and the front line seemed to redraw itself each day. German units that had expected a gradual, orderly Allied advance suddenly found their withdrawal routes threatened by American columns appearing where no American columns were supposed to be. For the German commanders trying to evacuate their forces across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy, the campaign turned into a nightmare. They had believed they would have days to pull out heavy equipment, reorganize, and withdraw in stages. Instead, Patton's push turned days into hours. Convoys were rushed. Bridges were blown too early or too late. Chaos crept into a system that relied on timing and control. By the time the evacuation was complete, Germans had lost far more equipment than they had anticipated. When Patton's men finally reached Messina, they arrived before Montgomery's troops, despite having started further away and fighting their way through difficult terrain. The Americans had covered roughly 200 miles in 39 days, much of it through combat. After-action reports written by German officers did not shy away from professional respect. One of them described Patton as fighting more like a panzer commander than an infantry general. He saw openings and lunged for them, striking at weak points before defenders could react, maneuvering his forces in a way that felt disturbingly familiar to officers trained in the doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement. He was not following what they believed to be American style. He was fighting them with their own playbook. Then, at the height of his Sicilian success in August of 1943, Patton made a pair of mistakes that nearly destroyed his career and that German intelligence watched with keen interest. During visits to 2 field hospitals, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what was then called combat fatigue, men mentally broken by continuous exposure to battle. Patton who believed in iron discipline and personal courage above all, saw cowardice where modern doctors would see trauma. He slapped one soldier and accused him of lacking guts. A week later, in a second hospital, he slapped another, even drawing his pistol and threatening to shoot the man. Word of the incidents traveled quickly up the chain of command and across the Atlantic. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, learned the details, he was furious. In the United States, newspapers erupted. The story leaked into the press, and suddenly, the hero of Sicily was under political siege. Members of Congress demanded that Patton be removed and sent home in disgrace. Editorials called him unfit to lead American sons in battle. For a brief moment, the most aggressive and effective American field commander looked as if he might be finished. In German intelligence offices, the reaction was very different. They had already identified Patton as the most dangerous American general they had yet faced. Now, they watched reports of the scandal and wondered if fortune had handed them a gift. Would the Americans really sideline their best offensive commander over a moral and political controversy? Officers reading Allied newspapers and listening to shortwave broadcasts allowed themselves a brief moment of hope. Perhaps their most troubling opponent would be removed not by German bullets, but by American outrage. Eisenhower chose a different path. He reprimanded Patton harshly, forced him to apologize to the soldiers he had abused, and temporarily removed him from public view. But he did not fire him. He understood something German commanders were beginning to understand as well. Men who could turn broken armies into offensive weapons and drive them across a continent were rare. Patton was too valuable to discard. German analysts noticed this decision and drew their own conclusions. If the Americans were willing to endure public criticism and political damage to keep Patton, it could only mean one thing: they were saving him for something critical. By early 1944, Patton was no longer in direct combat command. Instead, he was in England, appearing at public events, inspecting units, reviewing troops. On paper, he did not lead any of the armies that Allied planners had earmarked for the coming invasion of France. Yet German intelligence reports kept showing the same elusive figure visiting training grounds, driving along the English coast, giving speeches to American units. They knew he was there. They knew he was not attached to any of the obvious invasion formations. So the question loomed larger and larger. What was he really doing? To the officers in Berlin, the answer eventually seemed obvious. Patton had to be commanding the main invasion force. Everything they knew about him, and everything they believed about American priorities, told them that the Allies would never leave their most aggressive general on the sidelines during the most important amphibious operation of the war. They became convinced that whatever plan Eisenhower presented to the world, the real blow, the decisive attack, would come under Patton's command. What they did not realize was that in this case, their respect for Patton was being weaponized against them. The formation they believed he commanded, the 1st United States Army Group, was in many ways a ghost. It existed on organizational charts, in falsified radio transmissions, and in carefully planted rumors. Its tanks were rubber inflatables arranged on English fields. Its airfields were mock-ups. Its headquarters, plywood mock buildings. The British and Americans were running one of the greatest deception operations in modern history, and at its center, they placed George Patton, knowing that German intelligence would follow him like a lodestar. The German High Command convinced itself that this phantom army would cross at the shortest point of the English Channel, in the Pas-de-Calais region. They shifted their strongest reserves there. They strengthened defenses, laid more mines, and poured concrete into bunkers that pointed toward a blow that would never fall. They watched Patton's supposed headquarters near the coast and waited for the signal that the main invasion had begun. Then came June 6, 1944. Allied forces stormed ashore, not at Calais, but along the beaches of Normandy, roughly 150 miles to the southwest. The invasion Adolf Hitler had anticipated for years was finally underway. Yet inside German command posts, uncertainty reigned. Messages from Normandy spoke of fierce fighting, heavy bombardments, and multiple landing zones. But in the minds of many German leaders, one nagging thought remained. Where was Patton? Von Rundstedt and others argued that the Panzer reserves should be unleashed immediately to drive the Allies back into the sea before they could consolidate the beachhead. But doubts lingered in Berlin. What if Normandy was merely a diversion, a grand decoy, designed to draw German armor south while Patton prepared to lead the real invasion at Calais? Hitler, already suspicious by nature, leaned toward that fear. He hesitated. The armored divisions that might have counterattacked in those crucial first days remained leashed, held closer to the Pas de Calais, waiting for Patton and his Phantom Army. For 6 vital weeks after D-Day, while Allied infantry bled to carve out a tenuous foothold in Normandy's hedgerow country, some of the most powerful German armored units in France sat near the wrong coast. They stayed there because of one man, a general who was not even on the battlefield yet, but whose reputation and perceived role distorted German thinking at the highest levels. The Germans simply could not believe the Americans would stage the decisive blow of the war without George Patton. On August 1, 1944, Patton finally returned to the kind of role for which he had been born. He took command of the United States Third Army and entered the fighting in Normandy. The Germans, who had been nervously watching for his arrival, realized that their long-feared opponent had at last joined the fray for real. From that moment forward, their worst assumptions about his capabilities began to be confirmed, one after another. In the first 2 weeks of August, Third Army advanced at a pace that defied German expectations. Patton's divisions raced westward into Brittany to secure ports, then pivoted east like a striking snake toward the heart of France. German units that believed they held solid defensive lines woke to discover American columns behind them, cutting roads, capturing crossroads, and threatening headquarters. Telephone lines went dead. Orders contradicted each other. The neat front line on German maps dissolved into a confusion of arrows as Patton drove relentlessly forward. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced von Rundstedt as the senior commander in the West, sent increasingly frantic reports to Berlin. He wrote that Third Army appeared everywhere at once, lunging at weak points, bypassing strongholds, and turning any attempted defensive position into a trap. Every time German staff officers believed they had identified where Patton would pause to reorganize, fresh reports arrived showing him already past that line, pushing deeper into German rear areas. The tempo was simply beyond anything their strained command system could manage under constant pressure from Allied air power and collapsing morale. By mid-August, Patton saw a chance to end German resistance in France with a single decisive blow. German armies were retreating east through a narrowing corridor near the town of Falaise. If Allied forces could close that corridor from both north and south, they would encircle a massive concentration of German troops. Hundreds of thousands of men, along with their remaining armor and heavy equipment. Patton drove Third Army north, while Canadian and Polish forces pushed down from the north to seal the gap. The pocket began to close, and inside it, order disintegrated. German units received conflicting instructions: hold the line, break out, destroy equipment, save the guns. Officers tried to impose discipline as artillery shells and fighter-bomber attacks tore apart roads and convoys. Soldiers abandoned vehicles and tried to escape on foot through fields choked with wreckage. The sky above the Falaise pocket turned black with smoke. Those who survived later compared the destruction unfavorably even to Stalingrad. At Stalingrad, they said, there had at least been time to dig in, to prepare. In the Falaise pocket, there was only shock and collapse. Patton did not give them time. By the time the gap closed, German losses were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of prisoners, thousands more killed or wounded, and an irreplaceable amount of armor and transport destroyed. The German army in France was no longer a coherent fighting force. The road to Paris and ultimately to the German border lay open in a way that had seemed unimaginable a few months earlier. When the war ended, Allied intelligence officers sat across from captured German generals in quiet rooms and asked a series of simple questions. Which Allied commanders had you respected? Which had you found predictable? Which had you feared? The replies, coming from men of different ranks and fronts, were remarkably similar. Montgomery, they said, was methodical. He prepared carefully, built up overwhelming force, and then attacked in a way they could usually foresee. They respected his professionalism, but he rarely surprised them. General Omar Bradley, the senior American ground commander in Northwest Europe, was described as cautious and steady. Competent, yes, but not frightening. Patton's name drew different words: unpredictable, aggressive, dangerous. Von Rundstedt, in particular, is reported to have said that among all Allied generals, Patton was the one they feared the most. General Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded elite armored formations like the Panzerlehr Division, remarked that Patton was the only Allied commander who truly possessed the instincts of a German panzer leader. In Rommel, the Germans had seen boldness and unconventional thinking. In Patton, they saw those same qualities, turned against them. German doctrine emphasized speed, initiative, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness. The blitzkrieg that had overrun Poland, crushed France, and nearly destroyed the Soviet Union in the early years of the war depended on those principles. German officers were trained from junior ranks to think flexibly and strike quickly. Most Allied commanders, in German eyes, preferred to act slowly and by the book, relying on superior industrial capacity to grind down resistance. Patton did not fit that mold. He seemed to understand instinctively that war rewarded not just strength, but velocity. He had studied their tactics, internalized their lessons, and then used them with the massive resources of the American army behind him. Where doctrine said to pause and consolidate, he pushed forward. Where logistics officers advised a halt, he demanded that supplies keep up or be left behind. He trusted momentum, shock, and the psychological effect of relentless attack. To German commanders used to dictating the pace of battle, it was unnerving to face an opponent who played their own game, only with deeper reserves and more fuel. All of this came to a climax in the winter of 1944, when Germany launched its last great offensive in the West. In December of that year, German forces struck through the Ardennes forest, a region Allied planners had considered unlikely for a major attack. The blow caught them by surprise. Snow and fog grounded Allied aircraft. Tanks and infantry surged forward along narrow roads. American divisions fell back, some in panic, others in grim, fighting retreat. Reports filtered in of units cut off, ammunition running low, and towns changing hands multiple times in a single day. The map of the front bulged outward under German pressure. The world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. In a fortress city with a long military history, Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to an emergency conference. Around the table, faces were drawn and serious. The question was brutally simple. How soon could the Allies counterattack? Most generals, thinking in terms of standard staff procedures and logistical realities, spoke of weeks. Moving entire armies in winter conditions along icy roads already clogged with traffic was a slow, complex operation. They would need time to plan, to reposition, to gather fuel and ammunition. Patton gave a different answer. He said he could attack in 48 hours with 3 full divisions. At first, some of the officers in the room thought he was bluffing for effect, showing off in his usual flamboyant style. Turning an army 90 degrees and sending it in an entirely new direction in 2 days was supposed to be impossible. The staff work alone, they argued, would take a week. The supply convoys would need new routes. Units scattered over vast areas would have to be alerted, reorganized, and moved. But Patton had been thinking about this possibility for weeks. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had quietly warned him that German preparations suggested something more than a defensive posture. While others dismissed the risk of a serious offensive through the Ardennes, Patton told his staff to draw up emergency plans. If the Germans attacked north, how could Third Army pivot to strike them? Where would they go? Which divisions could move first? When the Ardennes offensive began, Patton already had those answers in his pocket. After that tense conference, he made a single critical phone call. Orders rippled outward. Within hours, convoys were turning, columns were shifting direction, and the enormous mass of Third Army began to wheel north. More than 250,000 men, with tens of thousands of vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces, moved across winter roads in an operation that even German officers later struggled to believe had happened so quickly. They had counted on the weather to delay Allied air power and on logistics to delay Allied ground reaction. They had expected days, perhaps weeks, to consolidate their gains. Instead, Patton's formations slammed into the southern flank of the German offensive in a matter of days. They hacked their way through snow-covered terrain, fought through ambushes, and drove toward the besieged town of Bastogne, where the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded, low on ammunition and medical supplies, and under constant attack. On December 26, 1944, Patton's lead elements broke through to Bastogne, relieving the defenders and stabilizing the southern shoulder of the Bulge. The great German gamble in the West began to unravel. After the war, when German generals were asked what had gone wrong in the Ardennes, many of them returned to the same point. They had underestimated how fast Patton would move. They believed they had bought themselves precious time by choosing winter, by striking where they thought the Allies were weak, by trusting in fog and snow to shield them. They had not imagined that a large Allied army could pivot so quickly and counterattack with such determination. That, in the end, was the pattern that haunted them whenever his name came up. From the first clashes in North Africa to the desperate days around the Falaise Pocket, from the ghosts of inflatable tanks in England to the snow-choked roads of the Ardennes, the Germans misjudged one thing over and over: how rapidly George Patton could act. Every time they believed they had enough time to reorganize, he was already attacking. Every time they thought he would pause, he pressed harder. Every time they tried to predict his next move, he did something just a little faster, just a little bolder than their assumptions allowed. So when historians and interrogators asked German officers why they feared Patton more than any other Allied general, the answer reached beyond personal charisma or battlefield theatrics. It came down to this: he thought like they did, but he was not bound by their limitations. He embraced speed, aggression, and risk the way their own doctrine taught them to. But he did so with the industrial might of the United States behind him, and with a willingness to ignore caution when opportunity appeared. Most Allied commanders, in their view, fought a war of plans and schedules. Patton fought a war of motion and shock. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the old Prussian who had commanded German forces on D-Day and who had faced some of the finest generals of the Allied world, put it plainly in his post-war assessments. Patton, he said, was the supreme master of mobile warfare. A brilliant practitioner of the offensive, he was the Allied general the Germans feared above all others. From the deserts and mountains of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, from Sicily's rocky hillsides to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, George S. Patton earned that fear the hard way, battle by battle, risk by risk, and one seemingly impossible victory after another, until the German generals who had once swept Europe with their own lightning campaigns finally understood what it meant to face an enemy who fought their kind of war, only better.